This video contains sensitive content related to infidelity and emotional betrayal. Viewer discretion is advised. The story you are about to hear is based on a true life experience, but all names have been changed to protect the identities of those involved. It was a regular Friday evening, or so I thought. My name is Bradley Hankins, and up until last week, I believed I had found my soulmate. Mary Mendoza wasn't just my wife. She was my best friend, my confidante, and the one person I thought I could trust more than anyone else in the world. But as it turns out, love isn't always as pure as it seems. And trust, well, trust can be nothing more than an illusion. Let me take you back to the beginning, because if you're going to understand the betrayal, you need to know the dream Mary sold me. We met 5 years ago, in the kind of way that feels like fate. I was at a coffee shop, nursing a lukewarm cappuccino and reading a book I had barely touched in weeks. She walked in like a storm, laughing at something on her phone, and the moment her eyes met mine, everything seemed to pause. It sounds cliché, doesn't it? But that's how it felt, like the universe had orchestrated that moment just for us. Within weeks, we were inseparable. Mary had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, the only one that mattered. She'd look at me with those big brown eyes and say things like, "I can't believe I finally found my soulmate." And I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She made me feel like I was her world. Fast forward to a year ago, life pulled us into a long-distance relationship. Mary had gotten an incredible job opportunity in a different city, a dream position she couldn't pass up. "It's only temporary," she promised me. "Just 6 months, maybe a year. And then, Bradley, I'll be back. This is for us, for our future." I supported her because that's what you do when you love someone, right? You make sacrifices. You trust them. But as time went on, I started to notice little things that didn't add up. Mary would cancel our nightly video calls with vague excuses. "Oh, I'm so swamped with work," or "I'm just too exhausted today." The text messages grew shorter, less frequent. When we did talk, she seemed distracted, like she was somewhere else entirely. I chalked it up to stress. I wanted to believe that the distance was just hard on her too. Looking back now, there were red flags everywhere. A friend of mine, Alex, even pointed it out once. "Bradley," he said, "are you sure everything's okay? She just doesn't seem as invested as you are." I laughed it off. "You don't know Mary like I do," I told him. "She's just busy. She loves me. I'm her soulmate." And then came that Friday. The day everything came crashing down. I was at home, scrolling through my emails when I saw a message pop up on my phone. It was from a name I didn't recognize, Jason Cooper. At first, I thought it was spam, but the subject line stopped me in my tracks. "You need to know the truth about Mary." My stomach dropped. I opened the email, and there it was, a message that shattered my reality in seconds. Jason wasn't just some stranger. He was someone Mary had been seeing while we were married. The email included screenshots, messages between him and Mary. In them, she called him her soulmate. She told him he was the love of her life. Sound familiar? Yeah, it did to me too. But it didn't stop there. Jason had found out that he wasn't the only other man in Mary's life. There was someone else, David Ross, another boyfriend she'd been juggling. Apparently, she'd been meeting up with David behind both our backs. Jason said he felt sick when he found out, and he couldn't live with himself if he didn't tell me the truth. I sat there, staring at my phone, unable to breathe. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it. My heart was pounding in my chest like it was trying to escape. Mary, my Mary, had been living a double life. Scratch that, a triple life. All while looking me in the eyes and calling me her soulmate. That night, I confronted her. I called, and when she picked up, her voice was as sweet as ever. "Hey, love," she said, like nothing was wrong. But I couldn't hold it in. "Mary," I said, my voice cracking, "who the hell is Jason Cooper? And don't lie to me." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. For a moment, I thought she'd hung up. But then she said the one thing that made my blood run cold. "Bradley, I can explain. This is just the beginning of a story that would completely destroy the life I thought I had. Stick around, because what I uncovered next was even worse than I could have imagined." It's strange how memory works. When you look back on something, you start to notice all the little cracks you ignored, the ones that were already forming, waiting for the perfect moment to shatter everything. But at the time, with Mary, All I could see was perfection. Or at least, what she wanted me to see. We met in the most unexpected way, at a cozy little coffee shop in downtown Seattle. I was just there to kill time between meetings, sipping on a cappuccino that had gone cold. And then Mary walked in. She was wearing this yellow sundress that made her look like the human version of sunshine, and she had this laugh, loud, unapologetic, infectious. I didn't know what she was laughing at, but it didn't matter. I found myself smiling like an idiot before she even looked in my direction. When our eyes finally met, it felt like the kind of moment you read about in novels. I know, it sounds dramatic, but that's how it felt. She walked over to the counter, ordered her drink, and just before leaving, she turned to me and said, "You look like you've been waiting for someone." Is it me? That was Mary. Bold, confident, and impossible to ignore. I laughed, and before I knew it, we were sitting at that same table, talking like we'd known each other for years. She told me about her love for art, how she wanted to travel the world and open her own gallery someday. I told her about my dreams of starting a nonprofit. It was easy with her. Too easy, maybe. By the end of that conversation, I was hooked. And I wasn't the only one. She made me feel like I was special, like I'd won the lottery just by sitting at that table that day. We went on our first date 2 days later, and it was like magic. We spent hours walking along the waterfront, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. Mary had this way of making you feel like you were the most interesting person in the world. She'd hang on to every word, her eyes locked on yours, nodding like she couldn't get enough. And when she laughed, God, that laugh, I swore I'd do anything to keep hearing it. Within 6 months, we were inseparable. Mary had this playful way of calling me her soulmate, like it was some inside joke. But there was nothing funny about the way she said it. It was earnest, raw. "You're my forever, Bradley," she'd say, her voice soft, her eyes wide. I've never been this sure of anything in my life. And I believed her. Why wouldn't I? Every day, she made me feel like the luckiest man alive. She'd leave little notes in my jacket pockets, things like, "Can't wait to see you tonight," or "I'm so proud of you, soulmate." She'd text me first thing in the morning and right before bed, always ending with, "I love you more than anything." Looking back, I realize now how carefully crafted those moments were. At the time, they felt so real, so genuine, but now they seem more like a script she perfected, a story she told to keep me hooked. But that's hindsight, isn't it? At the time, all I could think was, this is it, this is my forever. Then, about a year ago, life threw us a curveball. Mary got offered her dream job, an art curator position in Los Angeles. It was the kind of opportunity you don't say no to. It's only temporary, she reassured me. Just a year, maybe less. We'll make it work. We're strong enough for this. And I believed her. Of course, I did. The first few months of long distance weren't easy, but we made it work. We had a routine, video calls every night, text updates throughout the day, even surprise care packages. She sent me a custom notebook once, with a handwritten note inside that said, "For all your big ideas, I can't wait to build our future together." But as time went on, the cracks started to show. At first, it was small things. She'd cancel a call here and there, blame it on late meetings or being too tired. Then the text started to feel different. Shorter. Less enthusiastic. She'd still say she loved me, but it felt more like a habit than a truth. I remember one night, about 6 months into the distance, when I called her out of the blue. She answered after a few rings, her voice tense. "Hey Bradley, what's up? I'm in the middle of something." I could hear voices in the background, laughter, clinking glasses. "Just wanted to say hi," I said, feeling like an idiot. "Is this a bad time?" She hesitated, then said, "Yeah, kind of. Can I call you later?" That later never came. I convinced myself it was nothing. She was busy, stressed. I didn't want to be the needy boyfriend who couldn't handle her success. So I let it slide, just like I let everything else slide. The missed calls, the vague excuses, the growing distance between us. It was all so easy to explain away when you're wearing blinders. And then there were the red flags. The ones I ignored because I didn't want to see them for what they were. Like the time she posted a picture of herself at some gallery event, standing a little too close to a man I didn't recognize. "Oh, that's just a colleague," she said when I asked. "Don't be silly, Bradley." Or the time I caught her lying about a weekend trip. She told me she was going with friends, but when I pressed for details, she got defensive. Why do you always have to question me? Don't you trust me? And I did. I trusted her because I loved her. Because she was Mary, my soulmate. Because the alternative, the idea that she might not be who I thought she was too painful to consider. The truth is, Mary was a master storyteller. She painted a picture of our life together that was so vivid, so beautiful, I couldn't see the cracks beneath the surface. She told me every day that I was her forever, and I wanted so badly to believe her that I ignored every sign that said otherwise. And now, sitting here, recounting it all, I can't help but wonder, was any of it real? Did she ever love me, or was it all just part of the game she was playing? I don't have those answers yet. All I have is the memory of the life I thought we were building together, and the shards of that dream, scattered at my feet. But this is just the beginning of the story, because what happened next, well, let's just say, it's something you'll have to hear to believe. Looking back, I can't help but wonder how I missed all the signs. The truth was always there, staring me in the face, but I was so blinded by love, or maybe denial, that I chose not to see it. Now, as I replay everything in my head, the red flags feel as obvious as neon signs in the dark. It started with little inconsistencies. At first, they were easy to dismiss, small details that felt insignificant in the moment. Mary would tell me she was heading to bed early after a long day, but then she'd post an Instagram story hours later from some late-night event. I'd see the photos and laugh it off. Guess you weren't as tired as you thought, huh? I'd tease her. She'd always have an excuse ready, like, oh, I just stopped by for a few minutes, or it was a last-minute thing, I didn't think it was worth mentioning. But the more it happened, the more it felt off. Like the time she told me she was heading out with a group of girlfriends to celebrate one of their birthdays. She sent me a quick picture before she left, a mirror selfie, all smiles and dressed to the nines. But when I asked her later how the night went, her answers were vague, detached. It was fun, she'd said, shrugging it off. I pushed for more details, like who was there or where they went, but she just waved it away. Why does it matter, Bradley? It's not a big deal. I told myself I was being paranoid. Mary wasn't a liar. She was just independent. She didn't need to report every detail of her life to me, and honestly, I didn't want to be that guy who couldn't trust his partner. But still, something about those moments gnawed at me. Then there were the phone calls, or, more accurately, the lack of them. When Mary first moved to Los Angeles, we talked every night like clockwork. It was our ritual. No matter how busy our days were, we always made time for each other. But slowly, those calls became less frequent. At first, it was because of work. This new job is just so demanding, she'd say, her voice laced with exhaustion. I'm drowning in deadlines, Bradley. You have no idea. I believed her, of course. She'd send me pictures of her desk, piled high with papers and coffee cups, and I'd feel guilty for even questioning her. But then it started happening more often. I'd call, and she wouldn't pick up. Hours would go by before she'd text me back, saying something like, "Sorry, babe, I got caught up at work." Sometimes she'd forget to call altogether. When I asked her about it, she'd get defensive. Do you think I'm doing this on purpose? I'm trying my best, Bradley. Can't you just support me? I always backed down. I didn't want to be a burden. I told myself she was under a lot of pressure, that I needed to be patient. But deep down, I could feel the shift between us. There was a distance I couldn't explain, a wall I didn't know how to break through. Another red flag I ignored was Mary's sudden obsession with privacy. She'd always been open with me, sharing everything from her phone to her social media passwords. But somewhere along the way, that changed. One night, while we were on a video call, I noticed her phone buzzing constantly on the table. I joked about it, saying, "Wow, you're popular tonight. Who's texting you?" She laughed, but it felt forced. "Oh, just work stuff," she said, quickly flipping the phone over so the screen was hidden. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it kept happening. She started locking her phone, something she'd never done before. When I asked her about it, she shrugged it off. Everyone locks their phone, Bradley. It's not a big deal. And maybe it wasn't, but it felt strange. I told myself I was overthinking it, that she had every right to her privacy. Then there was my intuition, that nagging voice in the back of my mind that whispered, Something isn't right. I tried to silence it, convincing myself that I was just being insecure. But there were moments when it was impossible to ignore. Like the time Mary told me she was flying to San Francisco for a weekend work conference. I remember how excited she sounded on the phone, telling me about the fancy hotel they were putting her up in and the big-name speakers who would be there. But when I asked her for pictures, she said she was too busy to take any. "It's just a boring work trip, Bradley," she said. "You're not missing much." That Sunday night when she got back, I called to check in. She sounded distracted, almost guilty. I asked her how the trip went, and she gave me the same vague answers. "It was fine," she said, brushing it off. But something in her tone didn't sit right with me. It was like she didn't want to talk about it. My gut was screaming at me, but I chose to ignore it. I didn't want to be the paranoid husband who didn't trust his wife. Even my friends noticed the red flags. My best friend, Alex, was the first to say something. "Bradley, don't you think it's weird how distant she's been?" he asked one night while we were out for drinks. "She's always busy, always has an excuse. Are you sure everything's okay?" I defended her, of course. "She's just under a lot of pressure," I said. "Her job is intense. It's not her fault." Alex gave me a look, the kind that said he didn't buy it, but he didn't push. And honestly, I appreciated that. I wasn't ready to admit that something might be wrong. Mary had a way of smoothing over every doubt, every suspicion. She was a master manipulator, though I didn't see it at the time. Whenever I questioned her, she'd turn the tables, making me feel guilty for even asking. "I can't believe you don't trust me," she'd say, her voice trembling like I'd hurt her. "After everything we've been through, how could you think I'd do something like that?" And every time, I'd apologize. I'd tell her I was sorry for doubting her, for being insecure. She'd forgive me, of course, wrapping me back up in her web of lies. And I'd believe her, because believing her was easier than facing the truth. The truth was, I ignored my intuition because I didn't want to believe that Mary could hurt me. I loved her. I trusted her. I built my entire life around the idea that she was my soulmate. Admitting that she might not be who I thought she was felt like admitting that my whole world was a lie. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how wrong it was. It was a Friday evening, just like any other. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling absent-mindedly through my emails while a documentary played in the background. My mind had been restless for weeks, plagued by the lingering doubts I kept shoving into the corners of my mind. Something about Mary's recent behavior didn't sit right, but I kept telling myself that I was being paranoid, that she loved me, that everything was fine. And then my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar name pop up in my inbox. Jason Cooper. My first instinct was that it was spam. The subject line, however, froze me in place. "You need to know the truth about Mary." My chest tightened as I stared at the words, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My hands trembled as I opened the email, bracing myself for whatever was inside. The first line hit me like a freight train. "Hey Bradley, I don't know how else to say this, but I think we need to talk. There's something you should know about Mary." I read on, my pulse pounding in my ears. Jason explained that he and Mary had been seeing each other for the past year. A year. The same year she'd been in Los Angeles, promising me that the distance between us was temporary, that our love was unshakable. He wrote that he'd stumbled upon her messages with another man, David Ross, who, as it turned out, was also in a relationship with Mary. The pieces of my life, my marriage, began to fall apart before my eyes. Jason wasn't just making accusations, he had proof. Attached to the email were screenshots of text messages between him and Mary. As I read them, my stomach churned. There were sweet nothings that sounded painfully familiar. "You're my soulmate. I've never loved anyone like this before." Words she'd once said to me. But what set me over the edge were the explicit details. Jason included excerpts of conversations where Mary described her flings with both him and David. She talked about sneaking around, about meeting up in hotels, about the thrill of it all. One message in particular made me feel like the ground beneath me was crumbling. "I can't stop thinking about last night. You make me feel things I haven't felt in years." The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was physical. Jason laid it all out in excruciating detail, as if he needed to unburden himself of the weight he'd been carrying. He described how Mary had confided in him about her flings, including with men she'd met casually at events or through work. He even wrote about one night when she bragged about how exciting it was to be with someone new, someone who could give her what she wasn't getting at home. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to process the words in front of me. My Mary, my soulmate, had been leading a double, no, triple life. She had stood in front of me, looked me in the eyes, and told me I was her forever, all while sneaking around with not one, but two other men. And then there were the flings, the casual betrayals that seemed almost too brazen to believe. I didn't wait. I couldn't. I called her immediately. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before she answered. "Hey, babe," she said, her voice as sweet and casual as ever. I could hear faint music in the background, like she was out somewhere, completely unaware that her house of cards had just collapsed. "Mary," I said, my voice tight and trembling, "who the hell is Jason Cooper?" There was silence on the other end of the line. Long, suffocating silence. I imagined her standing there, phone in hand, trying to decide whether to lie or come clean. Finally, she spoke, but her voice was barely above a whisper. "Bradley, I can explain." I couldn't hold it in. Everything came pouring out of me. The email, the screenshots, the lies, the betrayal. "Explain," I shouted. "Explain how you've been calling me your soulmate while sleeping with 2 other men. Explain how you've been lying to my face for a year." She started crying, or at least she tried to. Her voice wavered as she stammered. "It wasn't like that. I didn't mean for it to happen." But her tears didn't move me. They felt rehearsed, calculated, just another performance in the long-running play that had been our relationship. "Was it worth it, Mary?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Was it worth throwing everything away? For what? For a cheap thrill? For someone who could give you what? What was I missing?" And then she said it. The words that would haunt me for weeks. "It wasn't about you, Bradley. It was never about you. I felt trapped. I needed to feel alive again." Her confession hit me like a punch to the gut. Trapped? She'd always told me I was her freedom, her happiness, her everything. And now suddenly, I was the cage, the thing she needed to escape. I hung up. I couldn't listen to another word. My hands were shaking, my heart racing, my mind spinning out of control. I felt humiliated, betrayed, shattered. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my life, was a lie. And the worst part, she didn't even seem sorry. Not really. She was more upset that she'd been caught than about what she'd done. Over the next few days, I pieced together the rest of the story. Jason and I talked on the phone, exchanging details and filling in the gaps. He told me about how he'd met Mary, how she'd swept him off his feet with the same charm and promises she'd used on me. He'd been as blind as I was, believing every word she said, until he stumbled upon her messages with David. David, it turned out, had been in the picture even longer than Jason. He was the friend she'd occasionally mentioned, but never in detail. They'd been meeting up regularly, and he, too, believed he was her only partner. And the flings? Well, those were just icing on the cake. Mary had a knack for making people feel special, for making them believe they were the only one who mattered. But in reality, they were just pieces in her game, a game I never even realized I was playing. This wasn't just the end of my marriage, it was the end of who I thought I was. I felt like a fool, like the blindest man on earth. But as I sat there, staring at the pieces of my shattered life, one thought kept running through my mind. How do you move on from something like this? When I hung up the phone that night, the silence in my apartment was deafening. It was as if the world had gone mute, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my life. My mind was racing, replaying every word of Mary's confession and every lie I had ever swallowed. I felt like I was standing in quicksand, sinking deeper with every passing second, unable to breathe, unable to move. The shock was immediate, visceral. My stomach churned as if I'd been punched in the gut. I ran to the bathroom and dry heaved over the sink, but nothing came up. I hadn't eaten all day. My body felt weak, shaky, like it couldn't decide whether to fight or shut down completely. The nausea wasn't just physical. It was emotional, existential. It was the kind of sick that settles in your bones, making you question everything you thought you knew about yourself and the person you loved. I collapsed onto the floor of the bathroom, my back against the cold tile, and stared at the ceiling. I couldn't cry. I couldn't scream. All I could do was sit there, numb, as the reality of Mary's betrayal began to sink in. She hadn't just cheated on me. She had dismantled the very foundation of our relationship. Every word, every promise, every memory felt like a cruel joke. That night, I didn't sleep. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her voice, replayed her lies over and over again in my mind. I kept asking myself the same questions, desperate for answers that would never come. Why did she do it? Was I not enough? Did she ever love me, or was it all just a performance? I got out of bed around 3 a.m. and started pacing the apartment, my thoughts spiraling out of control. The more I thought about it, the worse it got. I kept going back to the moments I'd ignored. The red flags, the inconsistencies, the gut feelings I had brushed aside. How could I have been so blind, so stupid? The shame was unbearable. The weight of her lies pressed down on me like a boulder, crushing me under its enormity. Mary hadn't just betrayed me physically. She had betrayed me emotionally, mentally, spiritually. She had sold me a dream, a vision of a life we were supposed to build together, only to rip it away and replace it with this nightmare. The worst part was realizing how thoroughly she had used me. Every kind word, every loving gesture, every promise she made now felt tainted, hollow. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the fact that she had taken my trust, my love, my vulnerability, and weaponized them against me. I felt like a fool, like a puppet whose strings she had been pulling all along. By the next day, my friends and family knew something was wrong. I couldn't hide it. My mom called me around noon, and the moment she asked, "Are you okay, sweetheart?" I broke down. The tears I couldn't cry the night before came flooding out, uncontrollable and ugly. I told her everything, every detail, and by the time I was done, she was crying too. My dad, always the stoic one, was furious. "She doesn't deserve another second of your time," he said, his voice tight with anger. "You're better than this, Bradley. You're better than her." But his words, though well-meaning, didn't offer much comfort. It didn't matter if I was better than her. It didn't change the fact that I felt like a shell of myself, like a man who had been hollowed out and left to rot. My best friend Alex came over that evening with a 6-pack of beer and a look of pure concern. "Man," he said as he sat across from me, "I don't even know what to say. This is unreal." He didn't try to offer advice or platitudes. He just sat there, letting me vent, letting me cry, letting me feel everything I needed to feel. "Whatever you need," he said as he left that night, "I've got you." For weeks I walked around in a fog, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to focus on anything but the betrayal. Food tasted like ash in my mouth. I'd pick at a plate of pasta or a sandwich, but after a few bites, I'd feel sick and push it away. My body felt heavy, sluggish, like it was carrying the weight of my heartbreak with every step. I lost 15 pounds in the first 2 weeks. The nights were the worst. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with memories and regrets. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with someone else, heard her lies echoing in my ears. I felt haunted by her, by the ghost of the woman I thought I knew. Work became impossible. I'd sit at my desk, staring blankly at my computer screen, unable to focus on even the simplest tasks. Emails went unanswered. Deadlines were missed. My boss eventually pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay. I wanted to tell him, but how do you explain something like this? How do you tell someone that your entire life has fallen apart, that you're not even sure who you are anymore? Every day felt like a battle to process the truth. I'd go through moments of anger, wanting to scream at her, to demand answers, to make her feel the pain she'd caused me. But then the anger would give way to sadness, and I'd find myself crying in the shower, wishing I could just go back to the way things were before I knew the truth. There were moments of self-blame too. I replayed every argument, every decision, every missed red flag, wondering if I could have done something, anything, to prevent this. Was it my fault? Was I not enough? Did I push her away without realizing it? The questions were endless, and the answers were nowhere to be found. It wasn't until one particularly bad night, when I found myself sitting on the kitchen floor at 2 a.m., clutching a bottle of whiskey and crying into my hands, that I realized I couldn't keep living like this. I had let Mary's betrayal consume me. but I couldn't let it define me. I didn't know how to heal, but I knew I had to try. The road to recovery was going to be long and painful, but it was a road I had to walk. For myself, for the man I wanted to become, for the life I still wanted to live. Healing doesn't happen overnight, but every small step forward matters. The days and weeks after the discovery were some of the darkest of my life. I woke up every morning feeling like I was still in the middle of a bad dream, only to realize it was all too real. The pain wasn't just emotional, it was physical. My body felt as though it had taken a beating, like the weight of my heartbreak had seeped into my muscles, my bones, my very being. I lost my appetite almost immediately. Meals became an afterthought, and the few bites I managed to take felt like swallowing sand. Within the first month, I had lost nearly 20 pounds. Friends commented on how gaunt I looked, how pale my face had become. But food was the last thing on my mind. My thoughts were consumed by her, by the lies, the betrayal, the endless why that echoed in my head. Sleep was no better. Most nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, reliving every moment of our relationship and every red flag I had ignored. My brain refused to let me rest. Even when I managed to drift off, I'd wake up from vivid nightmares of Mary laughing with someone else, walking away from me without a second glance. The anxiety was relentless, gripping my chest like a vice and making it hard to breathe. I felt like I was unraveling, piece by piece. My once stable world had crumbled, and in its place was a wasteland of doubt, fear, and anger. I couldn't focus on work, on friends, or on anything that used to bring me joy. I was a shadow of myself, a shell of the man I used to be. What saved me, or at least began to save me, was the support of the people who cared about me. My family rallied around me, even when I didn't want to talk. My mom would call every day, not to pry, but just to remind me I wasn't alone. "Take it one day at a time, Bradley," she'd say. "It won't feel like this forever." My friends were just as crucial. Alex, my best friend, checked in constantly. He didn't try to fix things or offer empty platitudes, he just listened. When I vented, when I cried, when I said the same things over and over, he was there. "This sucks, man," he'd say, acknowledging the pain without trying to downplay it. And somehow that helped more than any advice ever could. I also found solace in online communities. Late at night, when the loneliness felt unbearable, I'd scroll through forums and threads where people shared their stories of betrayal and recovery. It was comforting, in a strange way, to know I wasn't alone, that others had walked this same path and come out on the other side. Their words gave me hope, even when I couldn't find it within myself. As the weeks turned into months, I realized that healing wasn't just about moving on from Mary. It was about rediscovering myself. For so long, my identity had been wrapped up in our relationship, in the future we had planned together. Without her, I felt untethered, like I didn't know who I was anymore. But slowly, I began to rebuild. I started small. I went for walks, letting the fresh air clear my mind. I picked up hobbies I had abandoned during my relationship, reading, painting, even trying my hand at cooking. Each small step forward felt monumental, like reclaiming a piece of myself I had lost. Therapy became a lifeline. Talking to a professional gave me the space to process my emotions without judgment. My therapist helped me unpack the shame I carried, the guilt I felt for not seeing the signs sooner. She reminded me that Mary's choices weren't a reflection of my worth, but of her own flaws and insecurities. "You're not broken, Bradley," she said during one session. "You're grieving. And that's a process, not a failure." The hardest part of self-reflection was confronting the ways I had ignored my own needs in the relationship. I had overlooked red flags, silenced my intuition, and allowed myself to be manipulated because I was so desperate to believe in the dream Mary had sold me. Accepting that wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It taught me that love shouldn't come at the expense of my own well-being. As I began to heal, I started to see the experience for what it was, a painful but invaluable lesson. Mary's betrayal forced me to confront truths about myself, about love, and about trust. It taught me that the people we trust the most can sometimes teach us the hardest lessons. One of the most important lessons I learned was this: love is not blind. Real love doesn't ask you to ignore your intuition, to sacrifice your happiness, or to accept less than you deserve. It's not about words or promises. It's about actions, about showing up and being honest, even when it's hard. Another lesson was that healing doesn't happen overnight. There were days when I felt like I was making progress, and then there were days when the grief hit me like a tidal wave, pulling me under. But every small step mattered. Every moment of pain brought me closer to understanding myself and what I needed to move forward. To anyone watching this who has been through a similar experience, I want you to know this. You are not alone. The pain you're feeling right now is real and it's valid, but it won't last forever. Healing is messy and it's not linear, but it is possible. Give yourself permission to feel everything, the anger, the sadness, the confusion. Don't rush yourself to get over it. This kind of heartbreak changes you, but it doesn't have to destroy you. Take it one day at a time, and don't be afraid to lean on the people who care about you. Whether it's friends, family, or even strangers online, there is a community out there ready to support you. And remember, sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who teach us the hardest lessons. Mary taught me that trust should be earned, not blindly given. She taught me that loving someone doesn't mean ignoring your own needs. And most importantly, she taught me that I deserve better. And so do you. Today, I'm still healing. There are still days when the memories creep back in, when the weight of it all feels too heavy to bear. But those days are fewer and farther between. I'm learning to let go of the anger, the bitterness, the regret. I'm learning to forgive myself for the choices I made, for the red flags I ignored. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. I'm stronger than I was before. I'm wiser. And I'm ready to build a life that's rooted in truth, in respect, and in love. The kind of love that lifts you up, not tears you down. To everyone who's still in the middle of their journey, just remember, healing doesn't happen overnight, but every small step forward matters. Looking back on everything, I realize now that I wasn't stupid. I was trusting. I gave my heart to someone I believed in, someone I thought loved me as much as I loved her. And that's not something to be ashamed of. Loving with an open heart isn't a weakness, it's a strength. It means you're willing to risk vulnerability for the chance at something real. The fact that Mary betrayed that trust says more about her than it ever could about me. But I'll be honest, it's taken me time to get to this point. There were moments when I blamed myself, when I replayed every red flag, every ignored intuition, wondering if I was somehow at fault. But what I've come to understand is that love should never come at the cost of your self-worth. Love doesn't ask you to ignore your intuition or to silence the voice inside you that knows when something isn't right. If there's one thing I want you to take away from my story, it's this. Trust yourself. If something feels off, don't be afraid to acknowledge it. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where your love, your kindness, and your vulnerability are being taken for granted, remember that you deserve better. You deserve a love that values you, respects you, and uplifts you. To anyone who has ever been through something like this, betrayed, manipulated, left to pick up the pieces of a life you thought was solid, I want you to know that you're not alone. There is life after heartbreak, even when it doesn't feel like it. There is healing, even when it feels impossible. And there is strength, even when you feel at your weakest. This community is here for you. If you've experienced something similar, I encourage you to share your story in the comments. Let's support each other. Because sometimes the only way to heal is to realize that we're not alone in our pain. Thank you for listening to my story. It hasn't been easy to share, but if it helps even one person feel seen, understood, or less alone, then it's been worth it. If you found this video meaningful, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Together, we can create a space where truth, healing, and hope thrive. If you've ever been through something like this, know you're not alone. Share your story in the comments, and let's support each other. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real stories and insights every week. And remember, healing doesn't happen overnight, but every small step forward matters.